dollar. Dirt and money, no soul. Had to go and get it, ain't no time to kick it. Got a stack of flip for my foes. Dollar. Please tell me you can hear me. Don't turn your back and don't neglect me. Just let me know if you need me. Dollar. Let me watch out for my partners. Keep my money long, get my team strong. Let me run away from my problems.
Yup, what's good, original crew, man? We're back. We got a new Mr. Ballen. NASA scientist becomes a believer after this shocking incident.
A believer of what?
You already know. You already know.
A believer. I am now a believer. Okay, well.
Well, you know, right now, I sent you that, but I know you don't be reading my text.
I always read your text.
No, if I go to your text,
you sent it today?
Damn.
If it was sent today. Listen, if it was if it was sent today, then I haven't watched or read anything.
But there's with the drone things in New Jersey.
I had told you about that.
No, they said that they believe it was a new article. They said they believe it is to be alien.
Did you send me the article?
I think so.
Oh, okay.
I can't remember.
Well, anyway.
But they believe there's to be aliens. Ooh, they're coming. Ooh.
There's no telling what they have.
I don't know what's going on.
But yeah. Sorry.
At this point, they probably tell y'all it's aliens just so y'all can shut the hell up.
Some
real though. Let's be real. But hey, with that being said, before we get into it, make sure you check out the links in the description box.
Down below.
You already know where to go. If you want the first part, you gotta do it. Check out down below. Also, if you enjoyed today's visuals,
like it with a thumbs up.
I ain't gonna lie, I low-key didn't even want to do this one. But hey, I know we do it, so hey, you know what I'm saying? Sometimes I can put myself to the side for others. You know what I'm saying? But you know, if you know, you know. But you ready?
I'm ready, y'all.
Let's go. Let's check it out. Let's see what's about, y'all.
Today's story is about one of the most famous paranormal events in history. But it's not famous because of how outlandish the details are. Instead, it's famous for its credibility. Not only were there 12 witnesses who saw this thing happen, but also there was a NASA engineer who investigated this event and ultimately concluded that it must have happened because of tangible proof. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please replace the like button's stick deodorant with cream cheese. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Around 9 p.m. on December 29, 1980, a 57-year-old woman named Vicki Landrum rode in the front seat of her friend Betty Cash's car while her 7-year-old grandson, named Colby, who she was raising, sat between them. The three of them had just had dinner at a truck stop and were now on their way home, driving down a dark wooded highway near Huffman, Texas, which is a small town about 30 miles northeast of Houston. As they drove down the road, Vicki began to notice the windshield was fogging up from how cold it was outside and how warm it was inside the car. And so Vicki turned on the defroster. And as the windshield began to clear, Vicki noticed this bright light right out in front of them up over the trees. And at first, Vicki just figured, they were close to the Houston airport, and so that light must just be an airplane. But as the trio continued driving down this winding highway road, that light that Vicki really thought was a plane landing appeared to just kind of hover in the trees. And actually, as they drove, the light almost appeared to get closer and closer to them. So it didn't really seem like it was a plane. Now, at first, Vicki thought this was just kind of interesting and was curious about this light. But as they got closer and closer to this light, it became very obvious that the inside of the car was getting much warmer and stuffier than any of the heat settings would allow it to get, to the point where Vicki was actually sweating and panting from the heat. Now, all of this was happening really quickly, and so Vicki sort of went from being curious to being kind of anxious. Like, what was going on here? Like, does this light have something to do with the heat they're experiencing in the car? And then all of a sudden, the light that appeared appeared to be sort of behind the trees, suddenly came right out in front of the car, and Vicky screamed at Betty, "Stop!" And Becky jammed on the brakes, and they came to a stop, and blocking their path, maybe 100 feet in front of them, just hovering over the road, is this strange-looking aircraft aimed right at them. This craft was the strange light. For a moment, all three of them just stared in shock at this craft, like it was so unexpected and so unbelievable that this had happened. But then Vicky, who's sitting there still panting and sweating, she's looking out and she's realizing this craft she's looking at looks nothing like any other aircraft she had ever seen. The craft was a bit bigger than a car, it was diamond-shaped, and it was letting out these strange, loud roaring sounds, almost like an engine. It appeared to be glowing red hot, and periodically, with those loud roaring sounds it was making, fire would appear to shoot out the bottom of the craft, scorching the pavement right under it. And again, this strange craft is just hovering there right over the ground, appeared to be aimed directly at Vicky, Betty, and Colby. Pretty quickly, Colby began to cry. He was scared. But Betty, the driver, she said she couldn't go anywhere. The road was too thin. She couldn't really turn around very easily, and she couldn't drive straight and go under the craft and risk being burned by the flames. And so they were just kind of trapped there. And so Vicky and Betty sort of looked at each other like, okay, we're gonna wait it out and hope this craft just eventually flies away.
She could have thrown it in reverse. Throw it in reverse, Terry. You know what I'm saying? That's all she had to do, throw it in reverse. She can't.
Well, I just turn around like all together.
Or you could have drove.
Or
like Laura did in South Side. Meet me on the South Side.
Or what about like throwing it in reverse and maybe going around?
Throw it in reverse and just drive in reverse. Laura did in Southside
Okay,
with Ashanti. Why she couldn't do it?
But after several minutes, and the craft still had not departed, it was still blocking their way and periodically spitting fire into the ground, Vicky and Betty are like, well, let's get out and see what's going on here. Let's investigate. By this point, their fear and anxiety around this had sort of been replaced by just genuine human curiosity. I mean, what the heck is this thing? And so Betty, the driver, she gets out, and Vicky, she tells her grandson, stay in the car, so Colby's right here, and Vicky gets out, and the second she does, and she now has an unobstructed view at this craft, she suddenly remembered this Bible verse. So Vicky was very religious, and she had read in the Bible that one day Jesus would return to the earth, and when he did, he would return in a rain of fire. And so all of a sudden, Vicky believed that what she was looking at was not some aircraft, but the second coming of Jesus Christ. This was like a highly spiritual moment for her. But just as Vicky was about to go forward and actually inspect this thing up close, she heard Colby call out for her. He was crying hysterically. He was totally scared and upset. And so this kind of broke Vicky out of her trance. She turned around and went back to the car to comfort Colby. And when she got back to the car, she found Colby scrunched up on the floor underneath the dashboard like he was trying to shield himself from this craft. And so Vicky, she got right down there with him. She wrapped her arms around Colby and began praying with him to try to calm him down. But while Vicky and Colby were praying inside the car, Betty remained outside of the car, just staring at this craft. And it went on like this for about 10 minutes until Vicky, who's still tucked down there with Colby, heard that roaring sound coming from the aircraft get noticeably louder, like it was about to do something. And so Vicky poked her head up and she looked out the windshield, and sure enough, this craft was beginning to take off. It was getting higher and higher off the ground. Flames were shooting out the bottom of it. Betty was still outside staring at it. And then before long, this craft had shot straight up into the air and began taking off up and away from them at a really steep angle. And at the same time, Vicky suddenly saw this swarm of all these helicopters, these military-style helicopters, go right up around this craft, like they were escorting it. And then the craft and all these helicopters took off into the horizon and disappeared. After they were all gone, Vicky realized that what she had just witnessed was not the second coming of Christ. Because of these military helicopters that arrived as this craft took off, it told Vicky and also Betty that very likely this was just a US military exercise of some sort. And so a few moments later, Betty came back to the car and sat in the driver's seat, and Vicky, she climbed back into her seat and lifted Colby up to the middle seat as well. And for a moment, the three of them just sat there in silence. I mean, there's nothing blocking their way anymore. They're just sort of trying to process what just happened. Eventually, Betty just put the car in drive and began driving straight ahead, crossing right over that scorch mark on the pavement where the craft had been. About 45 minutes later, Betty pulled up to Vicky's house and parked the car. Vicky and Colby, they got out. They said goodbye to Betty. They didn't really talk about what they had just seen. They just said goodnight. And then Vicky and Colby headed inside the house. And as much as both of them did have things to say about whatever it was they saw, they just continued not to talk about it. They both were just kind of eager to go to bed. However, as Vicky was putting Colby to bed, he began to complain that his stomach hurt, and at the same time, Vicky began to realize that she also didn't feel very well. And shortly after that, both of them were vomiting in the bathroom, and this scared Vicky. She tried to tell herself that, maybe the reason they were sick is because they ate some bad food at that truck stop. But deep down, Vicky was very concerned that their nausea was somehow connected to that strange craft. And so it was a very long night, with Vicky and Colby being nauseous most of the time. But eventually they both did fall asleep. And then when Vicky got up the next morning, she still felt awful. And so Vicky, she rolled out of bed and made her way to the bathroom. And when she looked at herself in the mirror, she gasped. Her skin was bright red and blistered, like she had had this horrible sunburn. At this point, she knew whatever was going on here, it had to do with that craft. She just knew it. And so Vicky instinctively rushed to Colby's room to check on him to see if his skin was all blistered and red. And she found he was still sleeping, but she could see his skin was red and blistered in some places, but not nearly as bad as Vicky's. And so Vicky, she began thinking about the night before, and she remembered she had gotten out of the car and gotten closer to the craft. So she was sort of more exposed to the craft, if you will, than Colby, who stayed in the car and tucked himself down underneath the dashboard the whole time. And so maybe Vicky's exposure to the craft was higher than Colby's, which is why she looked worse. But as Vicky was thinking this through, she remembered that Betty had actually stayed outside the car for 10-15 minutes, much longer than Vicky had, the whole time just staring directly at this craft. And so immediately Vicky was worried that, if this is what happened to me, I can only imagine what shape Betty is in. And so Vicky ran to the phone, she picked it up and she dialed Betty's number and she listened, and it just kept on ringing and ringing. Betty didn't answer. Now, at this point, Vicky was in a full-blown panic, not only because she was worried about Betty, but also, she doesn't really know what's wrong with her or with Colby. She doesn't know if their sickness is going to get worse or better. Currently, she felt horrible. She was nauseous. Her skin seemed to be practically falling off. Colby was in less bad shape, but still not healthy. And also, Vicky didn't have the money to even go to the doctor to get looked at. And so as much as Vicky really wanted right now to just go check on Betty, go drive to her house and check on her, she couldn't. She needed to focus on herself and her grandson first and make sure they were okay before she did anything else. And so over the next few days, Vicky and Colby stayed home. They slowly regained their strength. And over those few days, Vicky actually would get Betty on the phone. And Betty would tell her that yes, she's also dealing with similar symptoms, but she was okay, which was very reassuring to Vicky. However, Vicky also knew that Betty was not a complainer, and even if she did have horrendous symptoms, she was not the type of person who would necessarily tell Vicky. She would sort of tough it out. Finally, after 5 days, Vicky felt strong enough to go check on Betty in person. However, when she got to Betty's house and went inside, she called out for Betty, but there was no answer. The house was eerily quiet. And so Vicky began walking around Betty's house looking for Betty. And eventually, Vicky walked down a hallway and reached Betty's bedroom, and the door was shut. Vicky called out for Betty, but there was no answer from inside. And so feeling kind of scared at this point, Vicky reached down, she turned the handle and opened the door, and immediately she saw Betty on her bed. And Betty looked horrible. She was barely conscious. Her entire body was red and blistered and bleeding. There was vomit all over the bed sheets, and there were all these huge clumps of Betty's hair littering her pillow. And so Vicky was horrified. She rushed inside, she scooped her friend up, and between the two of them, they kind of hobbled out of the house. Vicky put Betty in her car, and they sped to the hospital. A few hours later, Vicky was waiting in the emergency room where Betty was being treated, when Betty's doctor walked into the waiting room, at which point Vicky stood up and rushed over to him and said, "Hey, what's going on with Betty? What happened to her? What's going on?" But the doctor just shook his head and said, your friend, her skin is literally peeling off her face in sheets, and there are blisters breaking out all over her body. He told Vicky that her symptoms reminded him of radiation poisoning. However, he also told Vicky that that was basically impossible. For Betty, a woman who lives in rural Texas, where would she go to come in contact with something that radioactive? It just seemed not possible, so that couldn't be it. But Vicky, when she heard this, felt like she knew exactly how Betty came in contact with something highly radioactive. It had to be that craft. And so without even thinking about it, Vicky began pouring out the story of how her and Betty had seen this light, and then this craft appeared on the road, and it was shooting fire, and then it flew off with helicopters all around it. But as she was wrapping up her story, Vicky was suddenly overcome with embarrassment because the doctor was now staring at her like she was totally out of her mind. A month later, in early February of 1981, Vicky was at her kitchen table with the phone pressed to her ear. She was calling her local senator, who she had already written to try to tell him about this strange aircraft she had seen that made her friend sick. But Vicky did not have high hopes about this phone call because she had already been ignored so many times by so many people when it came to this story. So by this point, Vicky and her grandson Colby had basically recovered from their nausea and their burns. However, Betty had not recovered. She was still cycling in and out of the hospital. She was in constant pain. She still had burns all over her. And in fact, because of all these symptoms, she had to move in with her brother. Now, Vicky was certain that all these symptoms Betty had were radiation sickness caused by the radiation from this aircraft they came in contact with. But it was like everybody they told about this aircraft didn't believe them. Just then, Vicky heard a woman's voice break through the hold music. It was the local senator's secretary. And so Vicky quickly explained why she was calling and why she really wanted to talk to the local senator. But the secretary just told Vicky that, yep, she'll pass this along to the senator and he'll be in touch. Yeah. And then she hung up. And for Vicky, this was the moment she snapped. She felt like trying to navigate the proper channels to try to figure out what this aircraft was and what happened to Betty was not working because clearly nobody was taking her seriously. And so Vicky slammed the phone down and just sat there frustrated, having no idea what to do. But as she sat there, Vicky remembered there was actually one place she had not called yet, specifically because she didn't want to call this place. It was a UFO research center. And Vicky hadn't called because she did not believe the craft she had seen was a UFO. She believed it was a military aircraft because she had seen the helicopters escorting it away, and that made the most sense. It had to be military. But if she called the UFO Research Center and people found out about that, it would make her look even crazier because now she's claiming the craft was aliens or something. But now Vicky felt like she had run out of options. So she picked up the phone, grabbed the piece of paper with the number on it, and dialed. A couple days later, a scientist named John Schuessler drove down the winding wooded highway into Huffman, Texas. He was going to meet up with Vicky. John was an aerospace engineer for NASA. However, he also spent a lot of time investigating UFO sightings. Vicky's call to that UFO research center had created a lot of excitement in the UFO community, and the story had eventually found its way to John, who decided he would take on the case. Now, to be clear, John was not into researching UFO sightings in order to prove they really happened. Actually, it was sort of the opposite. He would look into reported UFO sightings in order to prove they were not UFOs. He would find a rational, scientific explanation that debunked the sighting. That's sort of what he did. And so with Vicky's case, that was his intention, to go to Huffman, Texas, talk to Vicky, and explain away with science and rationale what happened here. That this was not, aliens. This was something ordinary, like a government aircraft. And so John eventually got to Vicky's house, and he went inside and he chatted with Vicky, and she talked him through all the details of the story. And then eventually, they both left Vicky's house, they hopped in their respective cars, and headed out to go to the actual site where this had happened. And when they got there, and John got out of the car, he didn't need Vicky to direct him to the specific site, because right in front of him was this really obvious black circle right in the middle of the road, as if the road itself had been melted and then re-solidified and actually looked different. And Vicky said, that's where it was. That's where the craft was hovering. Those marks are from the craft. Now, this was great evidence that a craft really had been here, but John wanted more. He needed to figure out what kind of craft this really was. And so he told Vicky he was going to leave and go canvass the area for witnesses, and he told her he would keep her updated. So Vicky left, and John drove up the road until he reached some campsites and farmhouses. And John systematically went from door to door and tent to tent, asking anybody if they had seen or heard any aircraft or anything strange on the night of December 29th. Now, going into this, John didn't really know what to expect from these people he was asking. I mean, he's some random scientist showing up uninvited at people's homes, asking if they've seen strange lights in the sky. However, every single person he spoke to said that yes, they had seen that aircraft on December 29th. However, they were obviously just farther away than Vicky and Betty and Colby had been. So now, John felt like he had enough information to speak directly with military officials. However, when he contacted all the military bases in the area, all those officials he spoke to told him absolutely that on December 29th, there were 0 military operations happening. John found this very frustrating because to him, it seemed very clear that these officials were just lying to him. But what they were lying about and why was unclear. So John actually went to these military bases to speak to the officials face to face. And when he did, he showed them all the witness testimonies saying what they had seen on December 29th. And he also told them that with his own eyes, he had seen the black scorched mark on the pavement, where the pavement seemed to have literally melted in a ring and re-solidified from the heat of this craft. And to John, I mean, that scorch mark almost proved something had been there, very likely a military craft. But all these military leaders, despite hearing this and hearing John's testimony, they just said, you know what, you can gather up all the evidence you think you have here, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't prove that we were in the area. There was no military craft there that night. And so the bottom line was, the military was adamant they were not involved. And so the case really began to stall. John went home, but he couldn't stop thinking about the case. And so he kept in touch with his witnesses and periodically checked in with military officials, but nothing seemed to change. Except that Betty continued to get sicker and sicker, and Vicky actually began to develop other serious symptoms, like developing cataracts in one of her eyes. And then John got a frantic call from one of his witnesses. They told him they had just seen something truly incredible. And as John listened to the story, he felt his heart sink, because now he knew the military had been lying to him about being out there on December 29th. Clearly they had been, and very likely it was their aircraft that had made Betty, Vicky, and Colby so sick. But now, John also knew that any hope he had of proving this was now literally gone, because the witness told him that black government vehicles had rolled up to the incident site out on that road, and they'd come along with construction vehicles, and for no clear traffic-related reason, they had cut up one particular stretch of that road, taken it with them, and left. And that particular stretch of road that was removed just happened to be the exact spot where that scorch mark had been left by the craft. It was like they were taking the evidence and getting rid of it. Now, John himself was not able to literally go back to the road and see for himself where the pavement had been cut. However, not long after John learned this information, a group of UFO scientists descended on the road to find this scorch mark, or to prove it had been cut out and taken away like the witness had said. And sure enough, when they got out there, they didn't find the scorch mark. Instead, they found nice, fresh, brand new pavement. The strange event that Vicky, Betty, and Colby experienced on the night of December 29, 1980, is widely considered to be one of the most famous and credible UFO sightings of all time. It's now known as the Cash Landrum incident, after Betty and Vicky's last names, and to this day, nobody has been able to come up with a rational explanation for what happened if it wasn't a UFO. To this day, the US government maintains...
Let's see. Cause that's how I figure it would look like. Like that other photo, I'm like, it's too too. But I'm like, that makes more sense. Like this, like a diamond shape, but it's more cylinder diamond. You get what I'm saying? Like it spins.
For what happened if it wasn't a UFO. To this day, the US government maintains that they did not have any military operations happening on December 29th. However, they did say when it comes to cutting out the road and paving over it, that was just for routine maintenance. They were not trying to hide evidence. As for Vicky and Betty, over the years, their health continued to deteriorate. They ultimately filed a lawsuit against the government, but because they couldn't actually prove that the aircraft even existed or that it caused their health problems, their lawsuit was ultimately dismissed. Both women would eventually die from cancer, which Colby believes is a direct result from radiation exposure. As for Colby, he's still alive and continuing to seek answers.
Jeez.
Because he'll have remembers as well.
No, Colby.
That's crazy.
Most definitely. That. Yeah, it's no coincidence that both of them died from cancer. You know what I mean? Like, it's definitely from whatever happened on December 29th. And routine, come on now, really? Just so happened routine maintenance right after I come and talk to y'all and y'all deny it. Be for real. Liars.
Okay,
But that's sad though. I do think that maybe, because some people be like, oh, UFOs really don't, But I mean, yeah, that is something. You know what I'm saying? I'm not gonna put a name on it, but it was definitely something that y'all had going on that y'all don't want anyone to know about. It's just what it was, and what were you doing? What was the reason? And like, it's so much stuff. And I don't understand why stuff like, if like y'all are testing things or whatever y'all got going on, it's just like, why do it in the area where like.
But also, yeah, y'all didn't have any experiences going on, but y'all, doesn't necessarily mean nothing landed in the area and y'all had to move,
right,
like run
you
it
know what
off.
I'm saying?
Yeah, that's not an experiment y'all working on. That's something y'all have to deal with. Experiment and dealing with something is totally different.
But don't still, you're hiding something because now you're like, oh,
Lying.
Nothing happened. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, that's sad though. Rest in peace to both Vicky and Betty.
Well, at the end of the day, they were older women, so eventually they were.
But it's just the fact that they
This
suffered.
affected their health, yeah.
Yeah, like Betty, she suffered more.
I wonder, does Kobe deal with any effects? But it probably not, because he never got the car.
Yeah, but I mean, he did get sick, and if it's so, it's probably like, mild type of stuff. Don't know.
True.
I mean, you know what I'm saying, but. At the end of the day, yeah, they were older, but at the same time, like, she suffered before she even like perished, which is sad.
And I'll say this as well, like when it comes down to Kobe, he is able to still be here to like let it be known that what they saw, what they experienced, experience is not a lie. I was actual witness to it too, and I can back with my grandmother and her best friend.
Like, you can lie all day, but I know what I saw.
Yeah, I know the truth.
Yeah,
of what I saw. But again, we always heard that they always have lied. Then eventually they came out and said, no, there's truth behind it. But again, they continue to lie if there is anything. But also, they could be lying so the people won't panic.
Yeah.
Because, say for instance, comes out, there's aliens keep coming down here messing with us. What we gonna do about it? Not a damn thing.
Yeah.
So.
But that's crazy.
Y'all spit us up in the comments, man. Y'all let us know y'all thoughts about it for us in the comment section down below. But until next time, y'all know how it go, man. I do go by the name DJ New Kid. This is
Sierra Nicole.
We are.
Kid and C.
We are.
Go and get it, ain't no time to kick it. Got a stack of flip for my folks. Dollar, 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 dollar. Please tell me you can hear me. Don't turn your back and don't neglect me. Just let me know if you need me. Dollar, 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 dollar.